Sherlock Holmes and the Legend of the Victorian Chamber. Chapter 1. A most peculiar summons. The autumn of 1889 had settled over London with a peculiar chill that seemed to penetrate the very stones of the city. It was during this dreary season that my dear friend Sherlock Holmes found himself in a most contemplative mood. For nearly a fortnight, no case of significance had presented itself, and I had begun to observe the telltale signs of restlessness that inevitably preceded his descent into melancholy. Our lodgings at 221B Baker Street had become something of a prison to him. I would often find him pacing before the hearth, his pipe sending plumes of acrid smoke toward the ceiling, or else sprawled in his armchair with his long, thin fingers steepled beneath his chin, lost in thought. The cocaine bottle had made several appearances, much to my professional dismay, but I knew better than to lecture him on its dangers when his mind craved stimulation that ordinary life could not provide. On this particular morning, a Thursday if my memory serves me correctly, I had returned from my rounds to find Holmes standing by the window, his tall, lean silhouette framed against the fog-shrouded street below. Without turning, he addressed me. "Ah, Watson, your timing is impeccable. Mrs. Hudson has just admitted a most intriguing visitor to the house. Note the hesitation in the footsteps ascending our stair. Someone of advanced years, I should think, and carrying a burden of some weight, both physical and metaphorical." I had scarcely removed my coat when there came a gentle knock at our door. Holmes turned with uncharacteristic eagerness, his gray eyes suddenly alight with interest. "Come in," he called, and the door swung open to reveal a gentleman whose appearance was so striking that I found myself staring most impolitely. He was tall, though stooped with age, his face deeply lined yet bearing the unmistakable hallmarks of aristocratic breeding. His attire was impeccable: a heavy greatcoat of superior cut, gloves of the finest calfskin, and a silk hat that must have cost more than most men's monthly wage. Yet despite this finery, there was about him an air of profound distress. His hands, I noticed, trembled slightly as he clutched an ornate walking stick, and beneath bushy white eyebrows, his eyes darted nervously about our sitting room. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice carrying the unmistakable resonance of one accustomed to command. "Indeed," my friend replied, gesturing to a chair by the fire. "And this is my colleague and chronicler, Dr. Watson. Please do sit down. You have traveled from Berkshire this morning, I perceive, and the journey has been taxing." Our visitor started violently. "How could you possibly—" he began, but Holmes waved away the question with a flick of his wrist. "Your boots bear traces of a distinctive red clay found primarily in that region, yet your clothes are freshly pressed. The train from Reading arrived at Paddington Station precisely 43 minutes ago, allowing you just enough time to reach Baker Street by cab. The matter that brings you here must be of considerable urgency to prompt such an immediate visit." The gentleman lowered himself carefully into the offered chair. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Your reputation does not exaggerate, Mr. Holmes. I am Lord Edmund Blackwood of Thornfield Hall." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "The name is familiar to me. Your family's collection of medieval artifacts is quite renowned, I believe." "It is indeed, sir, and therein lies my problem." Lord Blackwood removed his gloves with deliberate care. "I find myself in possession of an object that has brought nothing but misfortune to my house. A chamber, a small portable chamber of Victorian craftsmanship, though its origins may be far older. It came into my possession 3 months ago, and since then—" His voice faltered. "Since then?" Holmes prompted, settling into his own chair, with the alert posture I knew so well. "3 deaths, Mr. Holmes. 3 inexplicable deaths, and a series of occurrences that defy all rational explanation." Holmes leaned forward, his interest palpably intensifying. "Pray, continue." "The chamber was acquired at auction. Christie's in London. It was part of the estate of Sir George Westmoreland, a distant cousin. The piece itself is remarkable. A miniature room, perhaps 18 inches square, crafted with extraordinary detail. Every element is a perfect scale reproduction of a Victorian gentleman's study. Tiny leather-bound books with actual pages, a microscopic chess set with carved ivory pieces, diminutive oil paintings in gilded frames. It is, by all accounts, a masterpiece of craftsmanship. And the deaths? I inquired, unable to see the connection. Lord Blackwood's eyes met mine, filled with unmistakable terror. The first was the auctioneer who handled the sale, found dead in his office the very night the chamber came into my possession. The coroner ruled it heart failure, but the man was only 40 and in robust health. The second was my own curator, Harrison, who had been tasked with authenticating the piece. He was discovered in the gallery, not 3 feet from the chamber itself. His face— He paused, swallowing hard. His face frozen in an expression of indescribable horror. Again, no cause of death could be determined. Holmes had closed his eyes, his fingers forming a steeple beneath his chin. And the third? My niece Emily, Lord Blackwood whispered, his voice breaking. Just 19 years of age. She had developed a fascination with the chamber, often sitting before it for hours, sketching its contents. 3 days ago she was found, just like the others. No mark upon her, no sign of violence or poison, yet undeniably, irrevocably dead. A heavy silence fell upon our sitting room. Outside, the London fog pressed against our windows like a shroud, dimming the already weak daylight to a ghostly pallor. The police, naturally, have been consulted? Holmes asked finally. Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard has investigated all 3 deaths. He believes them to be coincidental, a remarkable string of natural deaths that happen to share a common element. I, however, cannot accept such an explanation. Nor should you, Holmes said sharply, rising to his feet with sudden energy. The mathematical improbability of 3 sudden, unexplained deaths, all connected to a single object, stretches coincidence beyond its breaking point. There is agency here, malevolent and deliberate. I confess that a chill ran down my spine at his words, for rarely had I heard Holmes speak with such conviction about a matter that, on its surface, bore the trappings of the supernatural, a realm he typically dismissed with scientific contempt. You will show us this chamber? Holmes continued, already reaching for his coat. It awaits your examination at Thornfield Hall. I had thought to bring it, but after Emily's death— Lord Blackwood shuddered visibly. I could not bear to have it in my proximity during the journey. A wise precaution, perhaps, Holmes murmured. Watson, are you at liberty to accompany us to Berkshire? The afternoon train should suffice. Of course, I replied, though in truth the account had filled me with a profound unease. Excellent. Lord Blackwood, we shall meet you at Reading Station at 4:30. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar intensity that always presaged a most unusual investigation. The game is afoot, Watson, and it is no ordinary quarry we pursue. 3 deaths without apparent cause, a miniature chamber of mysterious provenance. We stand before a singularly opaque mystery. As Lord Blackwood took his leave, visibly relieved by Holmes's acceptance of the case, my friend turned to me with an expression I had rarely seen, one of genuine perplexity mixed with anticipation. What do you make of it, Holmes? I asked as the front door closed below. Several possibilities present themselves, none of them entirely satisfactory, he replied, pacing once more before the fire. Poison seems the most likely agent. Perhaps something exotic that leaves no trace detectable by conventional methods. Yet the specificity of the deaths, all in proximity to this curious object— He trailed off, lost in thought. Surely you don't credit the notion of a cursed artifact, I ventured. Holmes smiled thinly. My dear Watson, we have long established that when the impossible is eliminated, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. I do not yet know what truth awaits us at Thornfield Hall, but I suspect it will test the very limits of our rational understanding. As I packed a small valise for our journey, I could not shake the feeling that we were embarking on an investigation unlike any we had faced before, one where the boundary between the explicable and the phantasmal might prove thinner than my logical friend had ever been willing to admit. Chapter 2. The Chamber at Thornfield Hall. The journey to Berkshire passed in contemplative silence. Holmes had withdrawn into that peculiar state of meditative detachment I had observed countless times, his sharp profile turned toward the window, eyes fixed upon the passing landscape, yet clearly seeing nothing of it. I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts with idle conversation, instead occupying myself with the evening edition of the Times. We arrived at Reading Station precisely on schedule, where Lord Blackwood's carriage awaited us, an elegant conveyance drawn by two magnificent black horses. The coachman, a taciturn fellow with a weathered face, merely nodded at our approach, taking our modest luggage without comment. "My lord awaits you at the hall," he informed us gruffly. "He's not been himself since returning from London." The journey from Reading to Thornfield took nearly an hour, the carriage winding through increasingly rural landscapes as dusk settled over the countryside. Holmes roused himself from his reverie as we turned onto a long, tree-lined drive, the bare branches of ancient oaks forming a skeletal canopy above us. "Tell me, Watson," he said suddenly, "what do you know of sympathetic magic?" The question caught me off guard. "Very little, I confess. Some primitive notion that objects connected in form may remain connected in essence, even at a distance. Hardly a scientific concept. And yet," Holmes mused, "many scientific principles appeared equally fantastical before their mechanisms were understood. The telegraph would have seemed like witchcraft to our ancestors, would it not?" Before I could respond, Thornfield Hall came into view, a magnificent Tudor mansion, its mullioned windows glowing amber against the gathering darkness. The structure itself spoke of centuries of history, with later Georgian and Victorian additions harmoniously integrated into the original design. Lord Blackwood greeted us in the entrance hall, his earlier composure now visibly deteriorated. His hands trembled more pronouncedly, and his eyes darted nervously about as he led us through the mansion's grand corridors. "I've had the chamber moved to the library," he explained, his voice scarcely above a whisper. After what happened, none of the servants will go near the gallery where it was previously displayed." The library at Thornfield was precisely what one might expect of an aristocratic bibliophile. 2 stories of oak shelving laden with leather-bound volumes, comfortable reading chairs positioned near fireplaces at either end, and display cases containing artifacts of historical significance. However, all of these notable features receded into insignificance beside the object that had been placed upon a central table. There it stood, the Victorian chamber. And I confess that my first impression was one of profound anticlimax. It appeared to be nothing more than an exquisitely crafted dollhouse room, albeit one created with extraordinary attention to detail. Just as Lord Blackwood had described, the miniature study contained tiny furniture, microscopic books, and diminutive paintings, all rendered with astonishing verisimilitude. "May I?" Holmes asked, already reaching for his pocket magnifying glass. "Please," Lord Blackwood replied, though he took a noticeable step backward. For nearly 20 minutes, Holmes examined the chamber in complete silence, his keen eyes scrutinizing every minute detail through his lens. He did not touch the object but circled it repeatedly, occasionally emitting small sounds of interest. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he finally pronounced. "The artisan who created this was not merely skilled, but obsessive in his pursuit of accuracy. Observe, Watson. The tiny books on these shelves contain actual text, microscopic but entirely legible under sufficient magnification." I leaned closer, marveling at the precision. "Extraordinary. But what connection could this have to the deaths?" "That remains to be determined." Holmes straightened. Lord Blackwood, I must insist on examining the locations where each death occurred, as well as speaking with anyone who witnessed the bodies being discovered. Our host nodded grimly. Of course, though I fear Inspector Gregson has already removed any evidence he deemed relevant. Gregson is thorough in his way, Holmes replied diplomatically, but he often overlooks what I consider essential. Now, this curator of yours, Harrison, he was found here in the library? No, in the East Gallery, where the chamber was originally displayed. Emily, however, Lord Blackwood's voice faltered. My niece was found here, in this very room. Show me precisely where. Lord Blackwood pointed to a spot near one of the reading chairs. There, seated as though she had simply fallen asleep while sketching. The doctor said her heart had simply stopped. Holmes moved to the indicated location, dropping to one knee to examine the floor. After a moment he rose, his expression unreadable. And the auctioneer in London? You said he was found in his office? Yes, the morning after the auction. I never saw the body, naturally, but the news reached me through Christie's. Heart failure was the verdict, just as with the others. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. I shall need to interview your household staff, particularly anyone who had contact with your niece in her final days. Also, I require all documentation related to the chamber's provenance. Auction records, previous ownership, anything that might illuminate its history. As Lord Blackwood departed to arrange these matters, I turned to Holmes. What do you make of it? I asked quietly. Holmes's eyes returned to the miniature chamber. Several possibilities present themselves, none entirely satisfactory. The craftsmanship is Victorian, certainly, but some elements suggest influences from much older traditions. Note the peculiar symbols inlaid within the woodwork, almost invisible unless one knows to look for them. He pointed, and I bent closer, discerning faint patterns that had escaped my initial observation. I see them now. What do they signify? That, Holmes said with unusual gravity, is precisely what we must determine. For the moment, Watson, I advise against touching the chamber directly. We shall content ourselves with observation until we better understand the forces at work. The door opened, admitting a clearly agitated young man in the attire of a household secretary. My lord asks that you join him for dinner, he announced, his eyes carefully avoiding the chamber. He also wished me to inform you that Mrs. Pemberton, Emily's lady's maid, has agreed to speak with you afterward. Holmes acknowledged this with a nod. Excellent. We shall continue our examination tomorrow morning, when the light is better. Tonight, we gather information. As we followed the secretary from the library, I glanced back at the innocent-looking miniature. Against all rational thought, I could have sworn that something within it had moved, a microscopic shadow shifting behind one of the tiny windows. But that, surely, was merely a trick of the flickering lamplight and my own increasingly unsettled imagination. Chapter 4. The miniature, script sleep proved elusive that night. Despite my military training, which had taught me to rest whenever the opportunity presented itself, I found myself lying awake, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of Thornfield Hall. Twice I rose to check that my door remained locked, and once I was certain I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, light and furtive. Though when I peered out, I saw nothing but moonlight casting long shadows across the polished floor. Morning brought a thin, watery sunlight filtering through persistent autumn mist. I found Holmes already at breakfast, attacking a plate of eggs and kidneys with unusual vigor. Ah, Watson, he greeted me. You appear to have passed a restless night. The accommodations not to your liking? The accommodations were excellent, I replied, helping myself to coffee. It was my thoughts that proved uncomfortable bedfellows. Indeed, this case presents peculiarities that challenge conventional explanation. He lowered his voice as a footman approached with fresh toast. I spent an instructive hour before dawn examining Miss Emily's journal more thoroughly. Her translations of the microscopic Latin texts are fragmentary, but suggestive. What do they suggest? I asked. Holmes glanced around to ensure we were not overheard. That the chamber was constructed not as a curiosity or art piece, but as a deliberate magical implement, a gateway of sorts. The creator believed he could establish a connection between our world and something else. I nearly choked on my coffee. Holmes, surely you're not entertaining supernatural explanations? You, of all people? He smiled thinly. I entertain all explanations until they are disproven. The supernatural is merely the natural not yet understood. Remember, Watson, when the impossible is eliminated, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Lord Blackwood joined us shortly thereafter, looking haggard and drawn. I've had the laboratory prepared for you, Mr. Holmes, he informed us, and I've taken the liberty of having the chamber moved there as well, thinking you might wish to examine it in better light. Holmes nodded approvingly. Most thoughtful. I shall begin my analysis directly after breakfast. The laboratory occupied a converted conservatory at the rear of the mansion, a bright space filled with gleaming scientific apparatus alongside curiosities collected from around the world. The chamber had been placed upon a large oak work table in the center of the room. Perfect, Holmes declared, removing his coat and rolling up his shirt sleeves. Watson, I suggest you examine these materials while I analyze our crystalline residue. He indicated a stack of documents, auction records, correspondence, and provenance papers related to the chamber. For the next hour I sorted through these, while Holmes conducted various chemical tests, occasionally muttering to himself. Most illuminating, he announced finally. The residue contains traces of a compound unknown to traditional chemistry, perhaps some exotic alkaloid with psychotropic properties. Poison, then? I suggested hopefully, preferring a material explanation to any alternative. Possibly, though not in any conventional sense. He turned his attention to the chamber itself. Now for a closer examination of our central exhibit. Using his magnifying glass, Holmes began a meticulous inspection of the miniature room, occasionally making notes. After some time, he beckoned me closer. Observe, Watson. The microscopic books are actual volumes, with legible text, predominantly in Latin, but with sections in what appears to be a much older language. And note these symbols inlaid in the woodwork. They form a continuous pattern around the entirety of the chamber. I peered through the glass at his indication. Some form of decorative motif? Hardly. They are occult sigils, Watson. Protective. Symbols from various mystical traditions. Whoever created this chamber believed it required spiritual safeguards. Before I could respond, the door opened to admit Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard, his broad face set in an expression of irritation. Mr. Holmes, he said without preamble, I might have known you'd involve yourself in this business. Lord Blackwood informed me of your arrival. Gregson, Holmes acknowledged with a nod. I'm surprised to see you still in Berkshire. Has there been a new development? The inspector's expression darkened. Indeed there has. Another death, the undergardener, a young man named Thomas Wilkins, found this morning in the garden shed, apparently expired during the night. The same symptoms? Holmes asked sharply. Precisely the same. No marks, no signs of struggle, just dead. Heart stopped, according to Dr. Hartwell's preliminary examination. Holmes set down his magnifying glass with deliberate care. And had this gardener any connection to the chamber? Gregson looked uncomfortable. That's the peculiar thing. According to the head gardener, young Wilkins had been asked to deliver soil samples to this very laboratory yesterday afternoon. Lord Blackwood wanted to recreate some of Sir George's horticultural experiments. He paused. The chamber would have been here already. How long was he in this room? Holmes demanded. No more than 20 minutes, by all accounts. Holmes and I exchanged glances, the same thought evidently crossing our minds. This death broke the pattern of prolonged exposure. I must see the body, Holmes declared. Gregson led us to an outbuilding where Wilkins had been laid out pending the coroner's arrival. The young man appeared peaceful, as though merely sleeping, though I noted the same subtle expression of horror that Dr. Hartwell had mentioned regarding Emily. Holmes examined the body with his customary thoroughness, paying particular attention to the hands and face. "Look here, Watson," he said quietly, indicating a barely perceptible residue beneath the gardener's fingernails. "The same crystalline substance. Perhaps he handled it in the laboratory," I suggested. "Perhaps, or perhaps—" Holmes trailed off, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Gregson, I shall need to interview everyone who spoke with Wilkins yesterday." The rest of the morning was consumed by these interviews, which yielded little beyond establishing that Wilkins had indeed delivered soil samples to the laboratory and departed without incident. No one had seen him touch or even approach the chamber. We returned to the main house. Holmes remained uncharacteristically silent, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was only as we re-entered the laboratory that he spoke again. "Watson, I believe we must conduct an experiment." "What manner of experiment?" I asked, suddenly apprehensive. Holmes approached the chamber, studying it intently. In Miss Emily's journal, she mentioned a phrase, "the threshold between worlds being thinnest in perfect reflection." I believe she was quoting from the miniature texts. "Reflection, Watson. That may be the key." From his pocket he produced a small hand mirror. "I shall observe the chamber indirectly, through reflection rather than direct sight. If my theory is correct, this may reveal, well, let us see what it reveals." Before I could protest, Holmes positioned the mirror to view the chamber and bent to look into it. The change in his expression was immediate and alarming. His eyes widened, his face paled, and he drew in a sharp breath. "Holmes!" I exclaimed, moving toward him. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice tense but controlled. "It's just as I suspected. The chamber in reflection shows something quite different from what we observe directly, something moving within." Chapter 3. Whispers in the Dark dinner at Thornfield Hall was a somber affair, served in a cavernous dining room whose grandeur only emphasized the paucity of guests. Besides Lord Blackwood, Holmes, and myself, the only other person at table was Dr. Gerald Hartwell, the family physician who had examined Emily's body and signed her death certificate. "I stand by my conclusion," Dr. Hartwell insisted, responding to Holmes's careful questioning. "There was no external trauma, no indication of poison, no anatomical abnormality to explain the cessation of her vital functions. In all my years of practice, I have never encountered anything quite like it." "Yet you ruled it natural causes," Holmes observed, his tone neutral but his eyes penetrating. The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "What alternative existed? I deal in medical science, Mr. Holmes, not in superstition or fancy." The girl's heart stopped beating. "That much is certain. As to why?" He spread his hands in a gesture of defeat. "Were there any unusual marks upon the body?" Holmes pressed. "Any discoloration of the fingernails or lips? Dilation of the pupils?" "None whatsoever. She appeared as though she had simply fallen asleep and never awakened." Dr. Hartwell glanced at Lord Blackwood, then lowered his voice, though I will confess, in strictest confidence, that her expression troubled me deeply. There was a quality to it, a sort of frozen horror, that I have only observed in those who died in states of extreme terror. The same expression was noted on the curator Harrison, Lord Blackwood added quietly. Inspector Gregson remarked upon it specifically. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And the auctioneer in London? Was a similar observation made?" "I cannot say with certainty. The police report mentioned only that he was found at his desk, apparently having expired while reviewing documentation." "Documentation concerning the chamber, perhaps," Holmes suggested. A heavy silence fell over the table, broken only by the soft clink of silver against china, as the footman continued to serve a meal that none of us seemed particularly inclined to eat. After dinner, we retired to a small drawing room where Mrs. Pemberton, a thin woman of about 50 with prematurely white hair and nervous hands, awaited us. She rose as we entered, curtsying briefly to Lord Blackwood. "Please sit, Mrs. Pemberton," Holmes said gently. "I understand you were closely acquainted with Miss Emily during her final days." "Yes, sir. I served as her lady's maid for nearly 5 years." The woman's voice was soft but steady. She was a kind mistress, gentle in her ways and considerate of others. And her interest in the chamber? When did that begin? Mrs. Pemberton's hands twisted in her lap. Almost immediately upon its arrival at Thornfield. She had always been artistic, you see, loved to sketch and paint. But that little room, it seemed to fascinate her beyond all reason. She would spend hours before it, reproducing every detail in her sketchbook. "Did she ever touch it directly?" Holmes inquired. "Oh, yes, sir." She would adjust the tiny furniture, peer through the windows. In her final week, she even took to reading the miniature books through her magnifying glass, copying out passages in her journal. Holmes leaned forward intently. "These passages, do you recall their nature?" "I never read them myself, sir, but she mentioned they were in Latin mostly. Said they appeared to be some sort of ritual instructions, though she couldn't translate all the words." Mrs. Pemberton hesitated. "There was one phrase she repeated often, though, something about the threshold between worlds being thinnest in perfect reflection." I noticed Holmes's eyebrows lift slightly at this. "Her journal, it would still be among her possessions?" he asked. Lord Blackwood nodded. "In her room. Nothing has been disturbed since her passing. And in the days immediately preceding her death," Holmes continued, addressing Mrs. Pemberton. "Again, did you observe any change in Miss Emily's behavior or temperament?" The lady's maid glanced uncertainly at Lord Blackwood before answering. She began to have nightmares, sir. Terrible ones that would wake her screaming. And she spoke of seeing movement within the chamber. Tiny figures walking about, when no one was near." "Did anyone else witness this movement?" Holmes asked sharply. "No, sir. We all thought it was just her artistic imagination, perhaps strained by too many hours of detailed work." "One final question, Mrs. Pemberton. On the day of Miss Emily's death, did she say or do anything unusual?" A visible shudder passed through the woman's thin frame. "She told me she had discovered the chamber's secret, that it wasn't a model at all, but a window." "A window to what?" I asked her, and she just smiled in such a strange way and said, "To the other side, of course." After Mrs. Pemberton had been dismissed, Holmes requested to see Emily's room and journal. Lord Blackwood escorted us personally, leading us up a grand staircase to the east wing of the mansion. Emily's chambers reflected a refined feminine sensibility. Tastefully decorated in shades of blue and cream, with watercolor landscapes adorning the walls. A writing desk positioned beneath the window held several sketchbooks and a leather-bound journal. Holmes immediately gravitated toward these, leafing carefully through the journal's pages. "Most interesting," he murmured. "Her Latin translations are imperfect but revealing nonetheless. This passage here speaks of sympathetic chambers, paired constructions that create a metaphysical connection across dimensional boundaries. Surely you don't credit such nonsense," I said, perhaps more dismissively than I intended. Holmes glanced up with an enigmatic smile. "I credit observable phenomena, Watson. 3 people are dead, each after prolonged exposure to the chamber. That is fact, not superstition." He turned to Lord Blackwood. "I must see the gallery where Harrison died." The East Gallery proved to be a long, elegant corridor lined with display cases containing various historical artifacts and curiosities. Lord Blackwood indicated a spot near the center. "Harrison was found here, collapsed before the pedestal where the chamber was displayed. Like the others, his heart had simply stopped." Holmes circled the area slowly, his keen eyes scanning the floor, walls, and ceiling. Suddenly he dropped to his knees, extracting his magnifying glass. "What is it?" I asked, moving closer. "Residue," he replied quietly. "A fine, crystalline substance." Using a small paper envelope from his pocket, he carefully collected a sample. "Lord Blackwood, I shall require use of your laboratory facilities, if you maintain such. The late Sir George, my cousin from whom I inherited this estate, was an amateur chemist. His laboratory remains intact, though rarely used." "Excellent. I shall conduct some tests tomorrow. For now, one final question. Did Harrison, like Miss Emily, spend significant time studying the chamber up close?" "Oh, yes. It was his responsibility to authenticate it, assess its value, and research its history. He spent nearly a week examining every aspect of the piece, and the auctioneer would have done likewise," Holmes mused. "A pattern emerges, Watson. Prolonged, intimate observation of the chamber appears to be a prerequisite for its effect." As we retired to our assigned bedchambers later that evening, I found myself uncharacteristically reluctant to extinguish my lamp. Holmes noticed my hesitation as he paused at my door. "You sense it too, then?" he asked quietly. "Sense what?" "The atmosphere of this house. There is something fundamentally wrong here, Watson. Something that defies conventional explanation." "Holmes, surely. You don't suggest—" "I suggest nothing yet," he interrupted. "But I recommend you lock your door tonight, old friend, and perhaps keep your service revolver close at hand." With that disconcerting advice, he bid me good night, leaving me to ponder what manner of danger he anticipated, and whether it was of human origin at all. Chapter 5. Reflections and Revelations. For several tense moments, Holmes remained frozen, his gaze fixed upon the mirror's reflection of the chamber. His face had adopted an expression I had rarely witnessed, a mixture of scientific fascination and profound unease that sent a chill through my very core. "What do you see?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Holmes did not immediately respond, his eyes narrowing as he tilted the mirror slightly to alter his angle of view. Finally he spoke, his tone deliberately measured. "Movement, Watson. Distinct and purposeful. Movement within the miniature study. A figure, humanoid but not entirely human, moving among the furniture as though it were life-sized rather than miniature." Despite myself, I took a step closer. "Let me see." Carefully, Holmes cautioned, passing me the mirror while ensuring I maintained a safe distance from the chamber itself. "Do not look directly at the chamber while using the mirror, and do not approach it more closely." I positioned the mirror as Holmes had done, and peered into its reflective surface. At first I saw nothing unusual, merely the exquisite miniature, study rendered slightly darker in the mirror's imperfect silvering. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I perceived what had so disturbed my friend. A shadow moved within the tiny room, indistinct at first, but gradually resolving into a figure that glided between the miniature furniture with deliberate purpose. It appeared to be examining the microscopic books, occasionally reaching out with elongated fingers to adjust their positions. Though small in the reflection, proportionate to the chamber itself, there was something about its movements that suggested it would be considerably taller than a man if encountered at full size. "Good God!" I breathed, nearly dropping the mirror in shock. Holmes took it from my trembling hand. "Now we begin to understand the mechanism, if not the ultimate cause. The chamber serves as a window, or perhaps more accurately, a door, visible only through indirect observation." "A door to what?" I demanded, retreating several paces from the seemingly innocuous model. "That," Holmes replied grimly, "is the central question. Miss Emily believed it connected to the other side, a vague designation that might refer to any number of theoretical realms posited by occult philosophy." He placed the mirror carefully on the table, ensuring it no longer reflected the chamber. "What matters immediately is the danger it presents. 4 deaths now, each following exposure to the chamber. But the gardener, Wilkins—" He had only brief contact, I pointed out. Yes, and that troubles me greatly. The pattern is accelerating, Watson. The first victim, the auctioneer, spent days cataloging and handling the piece. The curator, Harrison, perhaps a week studying it. Miss Emily observed it for several weeks, but Wilkins required only minutes, as though the whatever it is growing stronger or more adept at crossing over, I suggested, scarcely believing the words coming from my own lips. Holmes nodded soberly. Precisely my thoughts. We must act quickly before further harm occurs. He moved to the laboratory door, locking it decisively. No one else enters this room until we better understand what we're dealing with. What do you propose? First, we must learn more about the chamber's origins. The auction records you examined. Did they reveal the previous owner? I consulted. My notes. Sir George Westmoreland acquired it in 1878 from the estate of one Professor James Moriarty. Holmes's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly ablaze. Moriarty? You're certain of this? The name is clearly recorded in the provenance documentation. I gather it holds significance? More than you can imagine, Watson. Holmes began to pace, his steps rapid and agitated. Professor James Moriarty, mathematician, author of The Dynamics of an Asteroid, and, I have long suspected, the organizing mind behind half the criminal enterprises in London. If this chamber was once his possession, its sinister nature becomes considerably less surprising. You believe Moriarty deliberately created it as some sort of weapon. Not created, perhaps, but certainly employed. Holmes returned to the mirror, lifting it carefully to study the chamber's reflection once more. The craftsmanship suggests mid-Victorian work, but these symbols, they draw from much older traditions. Babylonian, Egyptian, even pre-Celtic. In some instances, he set down the mirror again and extracted Emily's journal from his coat pocket. Miss Emily's translations of the microscopic texts suggest a methodology, a ritual, if you will, for establishing contact with whatever exists on the other side of this metaphysical doorway. Surely you're not considering not to open the door wider, Holmes interrupted, but to close it permanently. These protective sigils were incorporated into the chamber's design for a reason, Watson. They suggest that the craftsman, whatever his intentions, recognized the danger and sought to contain it. A sharp knock at the laboratory door interrupted our conversation. "Mr. Holmes?" called Lord Blackwood's voice. "Inspector Gregson requests your presence. There's been another development." Holmes and I exchanged alarmed glances. "What development?" Holmes called through the door. "One of the housemaids has fallen ill. Some sort of seizure. She's been taken to her quarters." "And had this made any contact with the chamber?" A pause. "Not directly, but she was assigned to clean this laboratory yesterday, before the chamber was brought here." Holmes unlocked the door, revealing Lord Blackwood's ashen face. "Take us to her immediately," he instructed, "and send for Dr. Hartwell if you haven't already done so." As we hurried through the mansion's corridors, I questioned our host. "This maid, did she display any unusual behavior before collapsing?" According to Mrs. Wilson, the housekeeper, she had been complaining of strange dreams since yesterday afternoon. Visions of a tall figure watching her from corners and doorways. The maid's small attic room was crowded when we arrived. Dr. Hartwell bent over the bed where a young woman lay rigid, her eyes open but unseeing, her lips moving in soundless words. Inspector Gregson stood awkwardly by the door while Mrs. Wilson, a matronly woman with a severe expression, pressed a damp cloth to the girl's forehead. "She's been like this for nearly 20 minutes, the doctor informed us. "Pulse rapid but steady, no fever, pupils responsive to light. I'd diagnose a cataleptic. Fit, but—" He gestured helplessly. Holmes approached the bedside, studying the maid's face intently. "She's speaking," he observed. "Or trying to." Bending closer, he listened to her barely audible whispers. After a moment he straightened, his expression grave. "Latin," he said quietly. The same phrases found in the microscopic books within the chamber. She's repeating them verbatim, though I doubt she has any classical education. "What does it mean?" Gregson demanded. Holmes met my gaze, and I saw in his eyes something I had rarely witnessed: uncertainty mingled with genuine alarm. "It means," he said slowly, "that our situation is more dire than I initially believed. The influence of the chamber is expanding beyond physical proximity. We are dealing with a contagion, Inspector, not bacterial or viral, but something equally transmissible, and considerably more dangerous." "What sort of contagion?" Lord Blackwood asked, his voice barely audible. Holmes's reply chilled me to the core. "One of perception, my lord. Once you have seen what dwells within the chamber, truly seen it, whether directly or in reflection, it begins to see you in return." Chapter 6. The Watcher in the Mirror. A heavy silence followed Holmes's pronouncement, broken only by the maid's faint, incomprehensible murmurings. Dr. Hartwell was the first to recover, his medical pragmatism reasserting itself. "Mr. Holmes, with all due respect, what you're suggesting borders on the fantastical. This girl is suffering from a neurological event, perhaps triggered by stress or exhaustion, but certainly not by some metaphysical contagion." "I understand your skepticism, Doctor," Holmes replied evenly. "It is, after all, the natural position of any scientific mind. Yet 4 deaths, and now this peculiar affliction, all connected to a single object, demand an explanation that transcends conventional medical understanding." Inspector Gregson shifted uncomfortably. "Let's say, for argument's sake, that this chamber does possess some unusual properties. What do you propose we do about it?" Holmes's gray eyes took on that familiar, steely glint that I had witnessed countless times when he had determined a course of action. "First, we isolate the chamber completely. No one else must be exposed to it, either directly or indirectly. Second, I must examine the complete historical record of its creation and ownership. And third," he hesitated, uncharacteristically, "I believe we must consult an expert in matters that fall outside my areas of specialized knowledge." "You cannot mean a spiritual medium or some such charlatan," I protested. "Certainly not," Holmes replied with a flash of his usual disdain for such fraudulent practices. "I refer to Professor Archibald Summers of Oxford, a scholar of ancient religions and occult symbology. His academic approach to such matters makes him uniquely qualified to assist us." Lord Blackwood nodded eagerly. "I shall telegraph him immediately. Oxford is but 2 hours' journey from here." "In the meantime," Holmes continued, "Dr. Hartwell, I suggest you administer a mild sedative to the girl. Watson, your medical opinion would be valuable." I examined the maid briefly, finding her physical condition unremarkable, save for her catatonic state and the continuous, whispered Latin phrases. "I concur with a sedative," I told Hartwell. "Perhaps chloral hydrate, in a moderate dose." "And the chamber itself?" Gregson inquired. "It must remain locked in the laboratory, undisturbed," Holmes instructed. "Under no circumstances should anyone view it, either directly or by reflection." As we departed the maid's quarters, Holmes drew me aside in the corridor. "Watson, there is a particular task I must ask of you, one requiring your steadfast nerves and absolute discretion." "Of course, Holmes." "Anything." He lowered his voice further. "Return to the laboratory ahead of the others. Cover the chamber completely with the canvas sheet on the work table. Do not look at it directly and, above all, avoid any reflective surfaces while doing so." The gravity of his tone impressed upon me the seriousness of the task. I nodded and made my way swiftly back to the laboratory, my service revolver a reassuring weight in my pocket. The laboratory was exactly as we had left it, sun streaming through the glass panels of the conservatory roof, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. The chamber sat innocuously on the central work table, its exquisite craftsmanship belying the malevolence Holmes attributed to it. Following his instructions precisely, I kept my gaze averted as I approached the table, focusing on the canvas sheet that lay folded nearby. With deliberate movements, I shook out the fabric and allowed it to settle over the chamber, effectively concealing it from view. Only then did I permit myself a sigh of relief, a relief that proved devastatingly premature. As I turned to leave, my attention was caught by a peculiar distortion in one of the laboratory's glass cabinets. A reflection, but not my own. A tall, elongated figure stood where my reflection should have been, its proportions subtly wrong in ways that defied precise description. Its face, if one could call it such, was a blur of features that seemed to shift and realign themselves, continuously. I froze, unable to look away, as a creeping coldness spread through my limbs. The figure in the reflection raised a hand in what might have been a gesture of greeting or warning. Its fingers were too numerous, too long, the joints bending in impossible directions. "Watson?" Holmes's voice from the doorway broke the terrible spell. "Is everything all right?" I tore my gaze from the cabinet and turned to him, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Yes, quite all right. The chamber is covered." Holmes studied my face intently, his keen eyes missing nothing. "You saw something?" It wasn't a question, but I nodded nonetheless. In the reflection, a figure, not human, as I feared, he murmured. "It has established a connection with you now. We must work quickly." He locked the laboratory door behind us, pocketing the key. "Say nothing of this to the others for now. Mass panic would only complicate matters." We rejoined Lord Blackwood and Inspector Gregson in the library, where a telegram was being composed to Professor Summers. Holmes dictated several specific questions regarding ancient binding rituals and containment symbols, couched in sufficiently academic language to avoid alarming the telegraph operator. The professor should arrive by the evening train, Lord Blackwood informed us. In the meantime, perhaps we should review what we know of the chamber's history. An excellent suggestion, Holmes agreed. Watson, your notes on the provenance documents, if you would. I produced my notebook, grateful for the distraction from the memory of what I had glimpsed in the cabinet's reflection. The chamber appears to have been created around 1865 by an artisan named Samuel Crooks, who was known for his exceptionally detailed miniature models. Crooks died under mysterious circumstances shortly after completing the piece. "Mysterious in what way?" Holmes inquired. The record is vague, noting only that he was found in his workshop, apparently having suffered a seizure or apoplectic fit. His face was described as being frozen in an expression of unutterable horror. "The same as our recent victims," Gregson observed grimly. "Indeed," I continued. The chamber then passed to a collector of curiosities, Lord Edmund Blackwood. "Your grandfather, I believe," I added, nodding to our host, who confirmed this with a solemn inclination of his head. He kept it for several years before selling it to Professor James Moriarty in 1871. Moriarty possessed it until his apparent death in 1878, after which it was sold at auction to Sir George Westmoreland. And now to me, through inheritance, Lord Blackwood concluded. A legacy I would gladly renounce, had I known its nature. Holmes had been pacing as I read, his brow furrowed in concentration. The connection to Moriarty is most illuminating. His mathematical genius often ventured into esoteric realms, theoretical dimensions, and non-Euclidean geometries. He may have recognized the chamber's true nature and sought to harness it for his own purposes. "But what are those purposes?" Gregson demanded. "What possible use could such an object serve?" "Knowledge, Inspector," Holmes replied, "or power, which often amount to the same thing. Imagine possessing a window into another realm of existence, perhaps one where the laws of physics differ from our own. The scientific and philosophical implications would be staggering. As would the dangers," I added, thinking of the reflection I had seen. "Precisely," Holmes agreed. "Which brings us to our most pressing concern. the entity or entities that appear to dwell within or beyond the chamber. They have claimed 4 lives already and now threaten a 5th. We must determine their nature and intentions before we can effectively counter them. Lord Blackwood paled visibly. You speak as though these things are sentient and purposeful. All evidence suggests they are, Holmes said gravely. The question is whether their apparent malevolence is deliberate or merely the inevitable consequence of contact between incompatible forms of existence. As he spoke, the light in the library seemed to dim momentarily, though the sun outside remained bright. A sudden chill permeated the room, causing the flames in the fireplace to flutter despite the absence of any draft. Holmes noticed it too, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the windows. It appears our time may be shorter than anticipated, he said quietly. The boundary between worlds is weakening. Professor Summers cannot arrive too soon. Chapter 7. The Oxford Scholar Professor. Archibald Summers arrived at Thornfield Hall as dusk was settling over the countryside. He proved to be a tall, cadaverous man of about 60, with a shock of white hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Despite his advanced years, he moved with surprising vigor, declining assistance with his battered leather suitcase as he strode into the entrance hall. Lord Blackwood, he greeted our host with a firm handshake. I came as quickly as I could. Your telegram suggested a matter of some urgency. His gaze shifted to Holmes. And you must be the renowned Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Your reputation precedes you, sir. Holmes inclined his head slightly. As does yours, Professor. Your monograph on Sumerian binding rituals was most illuminating. You've read it? Summers appeared genuinely surprised. It's hardly standard reading for a consulting detective. I find that knowledge in seemingly arcane subjects often proves unexpectedly useful in my profession, Holmes replied, this case being a perfect illustration. Introductions completed, we adjourned to the library, where Lord Blackwood had arranged for a light supper to be served. As we ate, Holmes provided Summers with a concise summary of the events surrounding the Victorian chamber, omitting no detail, however fantastic it might seem. The professor listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When Holmes concluded, Summers set aside his plate and steepled his fingers in a gesture remarkably similar to my friend's habitual pose. What you describe, he said carefully, aligns with certain metaphysical theories that have long existed at the fringes of established science. The concept of parallel dimensions or realms of existence separated from our own by barriers that are occasionally permeable. These ideas appear in numerous mystical traditions across cultures. Then you believe such realms might actually exist? I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. Summers smiled thinly. What I believe is immaterial, Dr. Watson. I deal in anthropological and historical fact. And the fact is that human beings have consistently reported experiences that suggest the existence of realities beyond our conventional perception. Whether these experiences reflect objective truth or merely psychological phenomena is a question I leave to philosophers. A diplomatically academic answer, Holmes observed, though not unkindly. But in this instance, we face practical consequences that demand practical solutions. 4 deaths, Professor, and potentially more to come. Indeed. Summers' expression sobered. I should like to examine this chamber as soon as possible, though with the precautions you've established. I must warn you, Holmes said, that even indirect observation through reflection appears to establish a connection with whatever entity dwells within. A risk I accept, the professor replied firmly. One cannot study the abyss without occasionally peering into it. Lord Blackwood provided Summers with Emily's journal and the provenance documents, while Holmes and I led him to the locked laboratory. As we approached, I felt an involuntary shudder pass through me, remembering what I had glimpsed in the cabinet's reflection. Holmes unlocked the door and ushered us inside, careful to ensure no one else followed. The laboratory remained as we had left it, the canvas-covered chamber sitting ominously on the central table. "Before we proceed," Summers said, extracting a small leather case from his pocket, "I suggest we employ certain protective measures." Opening the case revealed several items: a small silver mirror, a vial of clear liquid, and what appeared to be a piece of chalk. Holy water and consecrated chalk, I guessed, recognizing the traditional implements of spiritual protection. The professor smiled. "Nothing so mystical, Doctor. The liquid is a solution of certain minerals and herbs with documented calming properties for the nervous system. The chalk contains iron oxide and other compounds that interfere with electromagnetic fields. Science, not superstition, though the underlying principles may explain why such items gained religious significance." With methodical precision, Summers used the chalk to draw a circle around the table bearing the chamber, inscribing various symbols along its circumference. "Babylonian containment sigils," he explained, "combined with certain Egyptian hieroglyphs associated with boundary maintenance. If there is any validity to these ancient practices, they may help stabilize the dimensional threshold." Once the circle was complete, Summers positioned his silver mirror carefully to reflect the covered chamber, without exposing us to direct sight of it. "Now," he said, "I shall need to view the object briefly. I suggest you gentlemen remain behind me, focusing your attention elsewhere." Holmes and I obliged, turning our backs, as Summers lifted the canvas just enough to observe the chamber in his mirror. I heard his sharp intake of breath, followed by a muttered phrase in what sounded like ancient Greek. After perhaps 30 seconds, he replaced the covering. "Most extraordinary," he breathed, his academic detachment momentarily overcome. "It is precisely as you described, Mr. Holmes. A doorway, not merely a model. The craftsmanship is remarkable, but more remarkable still is the mathematical precision of its construction. The proportions conform exactly to certain ratios believed to facilitate interdimensional resonance." "Ejade, and the entity within?" Holmes inquired. Summers' expression grew troubled. "I glimpsed movement, yes, but could not clearly discern its nature. However, the very fact of its existence confirms my suspicions about the chamber's purpose." "Which is?" I prompted. "Communication, or perhaps invasion, between realities. This chamber appears to be one of a theorized pair of linked constructs. Its twin likely exists in the other realm, creating a sympathetic connection, a bridge, if you will, allowing entities to perceive our world and potentially enter it." The microscopic text Emily translated mentioned perfect reflection, Holmes noted. "Yes," Summers agreed. "That would be the key principle. Perfectly matched chambers, perfectly aligned, creating a space where the boundary between worlds grows thin enough to cross." "How do we sever this connection?" Lord Blackwood asked from the doorway, causing us all to start. "My lord," Holmes admonished, "we asked that no one else enter." "Forgive me," Blackwood replied, though he made no move to withdraw. "But this is my home, and these deaths are my responsibility. I have a right to know how to end this nightmare." Summers regarded him gravely. "Severance may not be simple, Lord Blackwood. The connection appears well established and growing stronger. The traditional approach would be to destroy the chamber physically, but that carries significant risks." "What risks?" I asked. "If done improperly, destruction might permanently open the doorway rather than closing it, like shattering a dam, holding back a flood. The entity or entities on the other side would no longer be constrained by the chamber's dimensions." A profound silence followed this pronouncement, broken only by the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the house. Outside, the wind had risen, whistling around the eaves of Thornfield Hall with an almost human moaning. "There is another approach," Summers continued after a moment, "a ritual of unbinding described in several ancient texts. It requires specific materials and precise timing, but if executed correctly, it should gradually dissolve the sympathetic connection without the catastrophic release of energy that physical destruction might trigger. "What materials?" Holmes asked, already moving toward his coat. "Most are common enough. Certain herbs, minerals, geometrically precise patterns. The critical element would be an object that has existed in both realms, something that has crossed the threshold and returned." Lord Blackwood's face paled. "But nothing has crossed over and returned. Those who made contact with the entity died." "Not quite all," Holmes said quietly, his gaze turning to me. "Watson glimpsed the entity in reflection earlier today. The connection has been established, but not yet fully realized." Summers's piercing blue eyes fixed upon me with sudden intensity. "Is this true, Doctor? You've seen it?" Reluctantly, I nodded. "In the cabinet's reflection. A figure, tall and wrong somehow. Its proportions, its movements, everything about it suggested something fundamentally inhuman." "Then you, Dr. Watson," the professor said with grim finality, "may be our only hope of closing this doorway before whatever waits on the other side can fully enter our world." Chapter 8. The Unbinding. Ritual. I confess that Summers's pronouncement left me momentarily speechless. Holmes, however, maintained his characteristic composure, merely arching an eyebrow as he regarded me thoughtfully. "Watson has indeed established a connection with the entity," he confirmed, "but I fail to see how this constitutes crossing the threshold and returning. He has merely observed it, albeit indirectly." Professor Summers began pacing the laboratory, his long fingers tapping against his chin. "The boundary between observation and participation is not as distinct as you might imagine, Mr. Holmes. In quantum terms, though I realize the theory is still in its infancy, the act of observation itself alters the observed. Dr. Watson's mind has, in a very real sense, touched the other realm. And this is sufficient for your ritual?" Lord Blackwood asked, his voice betraying a desperate hope. "It must be," Summers replied simply. "We have no alternative candidate, and time is clearly of the essence." He turned to me directly. "Dr. Watson, I must emphasize that your participation would carry certain risks. The entity has established a tenuous connection with your consciousness. Deliberately strengthening that connection, even momentarily, could potentially—" "Potentially what?" I demanded when he hesitated. "It could potentially allow the entity greater access to our reality through you," he admitted. "In the worst case, a form of possession might occur." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the laboratory's temperature. Holmes stepped forward immediately, placing himself between Summers and me. "This is unacceptable," he stated flatly. "I will not permit Watson to endanger himself in this manner." "The choice must be his," Summers countered gently, and weighed against the alternative, an entity of unknown power and presumably malevolent, intent gaining unfettered access to our world. The risk to one individual might be considered the lesser evil. "There must be another way," Holmes insisted, a rare edge of emotion in his voice. "If there is, I do not know it," Summers replied. "The literature is quite specific about the requirements." A heavy silence fell over the laboratory. I found myself staring at the canvas-covered chamber, knowing that beneath that simple cloth lay something that defied conventional understanding, something that had already claimed 4 lives and threatened countless more. The decision, I realized, was not really a decision at all. "I'll do it," I said quietly. "Whatever this ritual requires, I'll participate." Holmes turned to me, an uncharacteristic alarm evident in his expression. "Watson, you cannot—" "I can and I must," I interrupted firmly. "You yourself have always maintained that when the impossible is eliminated, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Well, the truth before us now is that something exists beyond conventional reality, and it's killing people. If my involvement can end this, then professional duty and basic humanity demand I try." For a moment I thought Holmes might continue to object, but instead His expression shifted to one of reluctant acceptance. "Very well," he said at last, "but I shall remain at your side throughout, prepared to intervene at the first sign of danger." "That would be wise," Summers agreed. "The ritual will require several hours of preparation. We should begin immediately." What followed was a flurry of activity that transformed the laboratory into something resembling an alchemist's workshop from centuries past. Summers dispatched Lord Blackwood to retrieve various items from his luggage, while Holmes and I cleared space on the floor for what the professor described as a containment diagram. Using the specialized chalk, Summers created an intricate geometric pattern, concentric circles intersected by triangles, and arcane symbols that he identified as derivations of Sumerian and Egyptian protective sigils. At specific points along the pattern, he placed small bowls containing mixtures of herbs, minerals, and liquids from his seemingly bottomless suitcase. "The physical components serve as anchors," he explained as he worked. "They create a sort of energetic scaffolding that will allow us to manipulate the connection between realms." "Based on what principles?" Holmes inquired, his scientific curiosity evidently piqued despite his reservations. "Principles that bridge what you would call science and what others might term magic," Summers replied without looking up from his work. "Resonance frequencies, symmetry breaking, quantum entanglement, though described in different terminology, these concepts appear in mystical texts dating back millennia before modern physics formalized them." As the preparations continued, I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. Twice I caught glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces around the laboratory. Not the distinct figure I had seen earlier, but shadowy, peripheral movements that vanished when directly observed. I mentioned this to Holmes in a low voice. "It's aware of what we're doing," he concluded grimly. "Professor, we may need to accelerate our timeline. Watson is experiencing increased perceptual anomalies." Summers nodded tersely. "The patterns are nearly complete. What remains is the focal component." He straightened, regarding me with solemn intensity. "Dr. Watson, I must ask you to surrender an item of personal significance, something intimately connected to your sense of self." I hesitated only briefly before removing my pocket watch, a gift from my father upon my graduation from medical school, and one of the few personal items I had carried through the Afghan campaign, and all the years since. "Will this suffice?" I asked, offering it to him. Summers nodded approvingly. "Perfect. An object with strong emotional resonance, carried close to your person for years. It will serve as an anchor for your consciousness during the ritual." He placed the watch at the center of the geometric pattern, then motioned for me to sit cross-legged. Beside it, Holmes positioned himself directly behind me, one hand resting supportively on my shoulder. "What now?" I asked, striving to keep my voice steady. "Now," Summers said, as he carefully unveiled the chamber and placed it opposite me within the outermost circle. "We establish deliberate contact with the entity, then systematically sever the sympathetic connection between realms." The laboratory's electric lights were extinguished, leaving only the glow of several candles placed at strategic points around the pattern. Shadows danced across the walls as Summers began to recite what sounded like Latin, interspersed with phrases in older, harsher languages. I fixed my gaze on the miniature chamber, now fully revealed. At first I saw only the exquisite craftsmanship that had initially drawn my attention. But as Summers's recitation continued, a subtle change occurred. The tiny room seemed to deepen, its dimensions expanding impossibly while remaining physically unchanged. The miniature furniture cast shadows that moved independently of the candle flames, and behind the tiny windows, a darkness gathered that was more profound than mere absence of light. "It's responding," Summers murmured, his voice tense with concentration. "Dr. Watson, you must now address the entity directly. Establish communication, but do not invite it closer." "What do I say?" I whispered, transfixed by the shifting shadows within the chamber. "Speak your truth," he replied enigmatically. Assert your reality against its intrusion. Drawing a deep breath, I addressed the void that seemed to be opening before me. I see you, I began, the words coming unbidden. I perceive your presence in our world, but I do not welcome it. You have taken lives that were not yours to take. You do not belong here. The response was immediate and chilling. A whisper that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly into my mind, in a voice that was not a voice but a sensation of crawling dread. We have always been here, in the spaces between, in the corners of your perception. Chapter 9. The Threshold. Between Worlds. The voice that was not a voice slithered through my consciousness, leaving a trail of ice in its wake. I felt Holmes's hand tighten on my shoulder, though whether in reassurance or alarm I could not tell. My vision had narrowed to encompass only the miniature chamber, which now seemed to pulse with an internal light, sickly and otherworldly. "It's responding to you," Summers murmured, his academic detachment cracking slightly. "Continue, Dr. Watson, but guard your thoughts carefully. Do not allow it to pull you deeper." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain focused despite the vertigo threatening to overwhelm me. "What do you want from our world?" I demanded of the presence. The answer came not in words but in sensations. Hunger, vast and ancient. Curiosity, cold and dissecting. And beneath these, something akin to envy, though so alien in its quality that the human emotion seemed a pale approximation. "Your solidity," it conveyed finally. "Your certainty. Your limitations that define you. The entity appears to be from a realm of less fixed physical laws," Summers interpreted, his voice hushed with scholarly fascination despite the danger. "A place of flux and possibility, without the constraints that govern our reality. And it seeks to enter our world permanently," Holmes concluded, his analytical mind evidently piecing together the fragmented communications. "To manifest in solid form." Through the perfect reflection, the entity confirmed, and I had the distinct impression of something pressing against an invisible barrier, testing its strength. "Through the doorway, crafted by your kind." Within the miniature chamber, shadows coalesced, forming a figure that grew increasingly distinct, tall and attenuated, with limbs that bent at impossible angles, and a face that seemed composed of shifting, geometric patterns rather than recognizable features. As it gained definition, I felt a corresponding dissolution in my own sense of self, as though my consciousness were being slowly siphoned to fuel its manifestation. "Watson," Holmes's voice, seemed to come from a great distance. "Your eyes, they're changing." "The connection is strengthening too quickly," Summers warned, his recitation becoming more urgent. "We must accelerate the unbinding before the threshold is breached completely." Through my increasingly distorted perception, I watched as Summers grabbed a vial of dark liquid from among his supplies and poured it in a precise pattern around my pocket watch. The liquid moved with unnatural purpose, forming symbols that glowed with a phosphorescence that hurt my eyes. "Dr. Watson," Summers addressed me sharply, "you must reclaim your anchor. Focus on the watch, on what it means to you. Your father's gift, your identity as a physician, your life before and after Afghanistan, all that makes you distinctly John Watson." I struggled to comply, forcing my attention away from the entity and onto the gleaming timepiece. I recalled the weight of it in my pocket through countless adventures, the sound of its ticking during night watches in medical school, the feel of the engraved initials my father had placed on its case. As I concentrated on these tangible memories, I felt the invasive presence recede slightly. The chamber's pull weakened, though the figure within it had now achieved an alarming solidity, its impossible anatomy clearly visible as it moved about the tiny study with deliberate purpose. "It's working," Holmes observed, his voice steadier. "Now, continue, Watson." Summers had begun the final phase of the ritual, his voice rising as he recited what sounded like a reverse invocation. Not summoning, but dismissing. Not binding, but releasing. The geometric patterns on the floor began to glow with the same phosphorescence as the liquid around my watch, creating a network of luminous lines that surrounded the chamber. The entity's reaction was immediate and violent. A silent howl of protest reverberated through my mind, accompanied by a wave of vertigo so intense that I would have collapsed had Holmes not been supporting me. The miniature chamber shuddered on the floor, its wooden structure creaking as though under enormous pressure. "You cannot close what has been opened," the entity insisted, its mental voice now threaded with what I can only describe as desperation. "The threshold has been crossed. We are connected." "No longer," Summers countered firmly, completing his recitation with a final triumphant phrase. He reached forward and, with a swift motion, overturned one of the small bowls of herbs, sending its contents scattering across the glowing pattern on the floor. The effect was instantaneous. The luminous lines flared blindingly bright, then began to constrict, drawing inward toward the chamber like a noose tightening. The entity thrashed within its diminutive prison, its form fluctuating between solidity and vapor. I felt a sudden, sharp pain behind my eyes, as though something were being forcibly extracted from my mind. My vision swam, doubling and then tripling. Before resolving into a kaleidoscopic array of fractured perspectives, I saw the laboratory from a dozen impossible angles simultaneously, including, most disturbingly, from within the chamber itself, looking outward at my own rigid form. "Hold him steady," Summers commanded Holmes. "The severance is nearly complete, but the psychic backlash could be severe." Holmes's arms encircled me, anchoring me as reality itself seemed to warp around us. "Stay with me, old friend," he murmured, his voice the only constant in my fragmenting perception. "Focus on what is real. Focus on Baker Street, on our cases, on Mrs. Hudson's complaints about chemical experiments in the sitting room." These familiar references provided handholds for my consciousness as it threatened to disperse. I clung to them, to the solidity of Holmes's presence, as the unbinding ritual reached its crescendo. Within the chamber, the entity made a final, desperate lunge toward the threshold, its form stretching grotesquely as it reached for what appeared to be the interior of the laboratories. Reflection. For one terrible moment I feared it would succeed, that some portion of it would escape the collapsing connection. But then Summers brought his hand down upon my pocket watch, pressing it firmly into the center of the glowing pattern. "By sympathetic bond, I bind you to your realm," he intoned. "By sacred geometry, I close the path between worlds. By willing sacrifice, I seal the breach." A concussive wave of energy erupted from the pattern, invisible but palpable, rushing inward toward the chamber with the force of a collapsing star. The miniature structure shuddered violently, then grew abruptly, impossibly still. Within it, the entity froze in mid-motion, its elongated form gradually fading from view like smoke dispersing in a breeze. My fragmented vision slowly reintegrated, the kaleidoscope of perspectives collapsing back into a single, coherent viewpoint. The pain behind my eyes subsided to a dull throb, and I became aware that I was drenched in cold sweat, trembling uncontrollably in Holmes's supportive embrace. "Is it done?" Lord Blackwood asked from the doorway, his voice barely above a whisper. I hadn't even noticed his presence during the ritual. Summers, looking suddenly much older and deeply exhausted, nodded gravely. "The connection is severed. The threshold is closed." He gestured toward the chamber, which now appeared as nothing, more than an exquisite miniature room, devoid of the otherworldly presence that had inhabited it. Though what remains is still a masterpiece of craftsmanship, it is now merely that, an object, not a doorway. "And Watson?" Holmes demanded, his customary detachment giving way to evident concern. "What of the connection established with him?" "Broken." "Along with the threshold," Summers assured him. though he studied me with a scholar's careful attention. Though Dr. Watson may experience echoes for a time, dreams perhaps, or momentary sensations of the other realm. But these should fade as the severance completes itself. I attempted to stand, only to discover that my legs refused to support me. Holmes caught me before I could fall, easing me back to a seated position on the floor. "Rest, Watson," he advised gently. "You've endured what few men could have withstood." As my strength gradually returned, I found myself staring at the chamber with a mixture of fascination and residual dread. The brilliant craftsmanship remained, but the sense of depth, of something beyond the tiny windows and doors, had vanished completely. It was, as Summers had said, merely an object now, extraordinary, but fundamentally mundane. "What should be done with it?" Lord Blackwood asked, eyeing the chamber with understandable apprehension. Summers considered this question carefully. "The connection is severed, but the potential remains. Such a perfectly crafted sympathetic vessel could, theoretically, be reactivated under the right circumstances. I would recommend its destruction, to be absolutely certain." "No," I found myself saying, surprising even myself with the vehemence of my objection. "Not destruction. Study, controlled, careful study." All three men turned to me in evident surprise. "Watson?" Holmes inquired, his expression puzzled. "What we've encountered here," I explained, my thoughts clarifying as I spoke, "represents knowledge beyond our current understanding. To destroy it completely would be to forfeit that knowledge. With proper precautions, it could advance our comprehension of reality itself." Chapter 10. Aftermath and Analysis. The silence that followed my unexpected declaration was eventually broken by Holmes, who regarded me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Watson, this is most unlike you," he observed carefully. "Normally, you advocate for the most cautious approach in matters touching on the supernatural." I struggled to articulate the strange certainty I felt. "I remain a man of science, Holmes. What we encountered here wasn't supernatural in the traditional sense. It was natural, but operating according to principles beyond our current understanding. Like electricity or radiation before we comprehended their properties." Professor Summers studied me with renewed interest. "The doctor has a point. The boundary between science and the so-called occult has always been permeable. Today's mysticism often becomes tomorrow's established theory." "At the cost of 4 lives already," Lord Blackwood reminded us sharply. "And nearly a fifth in Dr. Watson himself. The risk seems disproportionate to any potential knowledge gained." I felt a lingering echo of the entity's presence in my mind, not its consciousness, but an impression of its perspective, like the afterimage of a bright light. Upon closing one's eyes, from this peculiar vantage point, the chamber appeared simultaneously mundane and extraordinary, a marvel of human craftsmanship that had inadvertently tapped into fundamental forces of reality. The danger lay not in the knowledge itself, I argued, but in our ignorance of what we were dealing with. Now that we understand its nature and have means to control it, proper study might yield insights into the very fabric of existence. Holmes was watching me with an intensity that suggested he was conducting one of his famous deductions. "Watson, during the ritual, you experienced direct mental contact with the entity. Has this altered your perception in some lasting way?" The question struck uncomfortably close to the truth. I felt changed, though not in any way I could precisely name. It was as though a veil had been partially lifted, allowing me glimpses of a reality more complex than I had previously imagined. "Perhaps," I admitted, "but not in a manner that compromises my judgment. If anything, the experience has expanded my scientific curiosity rather than diminishing it." Summers nodded thoughtfully. "This is not unprecedented. Historical accounts of similar encounters often mention a broadening of perspective among those who survive them. The human mind, confronted with evidence that challenges its fundamental understanding of reality, must either expand to accommodate new possibilities or retreat into denial. And you believe Watson's mind has expanded? Holmes asked, his tone suggesting he found the concept dubious at best. I believe he has integrated his experience rather than rejecting it, Summers clarified. A healthier response than most, frankly. Lord Blackwood had been pacing nervously throughout this exchange. Now he stopped, his aristocratic features set in a determined expression. Gentlemen, while this philosophical discussion is undoubtedly fascinating, we have practical matters to address. Inspector Gregson will expect explanations for 4 deaths that we can hardly attribute to an interdimensional entity without appearing completely mad. A valid concern, Holmes acknowledged, rising smoothly to his feet and offering me a hand up. I accepted, noting that my strength had largely returned, though a profound exhaustion lingered in my bones. The official explanation will need to satisfy both the legal requirements and protect Lord Blackwood's reputation. What do you propose? Blackwood asked. Holmes's eyes took on the keen gleam that indicated his formidable mind was constructing a solution. A rare poison, I think, undetectable by conventional methods, perhaps absorbed through the skin while handling the chamber. The curator and Miss Emily had extended contact with it, while the gardener transferred trace amounts while cleaning in the laboratory. And the auctioneer in London? I prompted, seeing the logic of his approach. He would have handled the chamber extensively during cataloging. The delayed effect of the poison explains why deaths occurred at different intervals after exposure. The police will want to identify this poison, Lord Blackwood pointed out. They can try, Holmes replied with a slight smile. I shall suggest to Inspector Gregson that it resembles certain South American compounds I've encountered in previous cases. Difficult to isolate once absorbed into the body, and virtually undetectable after death except by very specialized testing that, unfortunately, is not available to provincial authorities. A fabrication, but a plausible one, I noted, impressed as always by Holmes's ability to construct convincing narratives from partial truths. As for the chamber itself, Holmes continued, turning to Summers, I propose a compromise. Rather than destruction or continued study here at Thornfield, where painful memories would persist, perhaps the British Museum could establish a secure research protocol under Professor Summers's supervision. The professor nodded approvingly. With proper precautions and a full understanding of its potential, the risks could be minimized while preserving the opportunity for legitimate scientific inquiry. Lord Blackwood considered this proposal, his reluctance evident, but gradually giving way to acceptance. If you can provide assurances that no one else will suffer as Emily did, I could be persuaded to donate it for scientific purposes. Her passion for knowledge would make that a fitting memorial. I can design appropriate containment protocols, Summers assured him. Physical barriers, regular monitoring for any signs of interdimensional activity, strict limitations on direct observation. The chamber would be treated as we would handle radioactive material, with respect for its power and appropriate safety measures. The matter thus tentatively settled, we agreed that Holmes would speak with Inspector Gregson in the morning to provide our carefully constructed explanation. The chamber would remain in the laboratory overnight, covered and sealed within the protective circle Summers had created, until arrangements could be made for its secure transport. As we prepared to retire for what remained of the night, Holmes drew me aside in the corridor. Are you quite certain you're yourself, Watson? He asked quietly, his penetrating gaze searching my face for any sign of lingering influence. Quite myself, I assured him, though in truth I wasn't entirely certain what that meant anymore. The experience had changed me, subtly but undeniably. Though perhaps with a broader appreciation for the mysteries of existence than before, he studied me a moment longer, then nodded, apparently satisfied. The pursuit of knowledge often changes us, especially when it leads us into unfamiliar territories. Just promise me one thing. What's that? If you begin to experience any unusual symptoms, dreams, visions, voices, you'll tell me immediately. No misguided stoicism or professional pride. I smiled at his concern, genuinely touched by it. You have my word, Holmes, though I expect nothing more severe than a particularly vivid nightmare or two. As I finally lay in bed, exhaustion overcame me swiftly. My last conscious thought before sleep claimed me was of the entity and its curious envy of our solid, defined existence. How strange that we humans often yearn for transcendence, for escape from our physical limitations, while beings from beyond might covet precisely those constraints that define our reality. In my dreams that night, I stood at a threshold between worlds, not as an intruder or a victim, but as an observer privileged to glimpse a larger cosmos than I had previously imagined. The terror of our encounter had faded, replaced by a profound sense of wonder at the vastness and complexity of existence. And somewhere just beyond perception, I sensed the entity watching, not with malevolence now, but with a curious respect, one explorer acknowledging another across an unbridgeable divide. Chapter 11. The lingering mystery morning brought a transformed atmosphere to Thornfield Hall. The oppressive sense of dread that had permeated the mansion seemed to have lifted, replaced by the ordinary sounds of a great house stirring to life. Servants, moving about their duties, the clatter of breakfast preparations in the kitchen below, birds singing in the gardens outside my window. Even the weather had improved, autumn sunshine streaming through the curtains as I rose and prepared myself for the day. Holmes was already in the breakfast room when I arrived, deep in conversation with Inspector Gregson. The detective's broad, ruddy face bore an expression of skepticism, gradually giving way to reluctant acceptance as Holmes expounded on his theory of an exotic poison. "You say you've encountered similar compounds in South America, Mr. Holmes?" Gregson was asking, making notes in a small police notebook. "During the investigation of the Wilson smuggling case in '87, Holmes confirmed smoothly. A particularly insidious toxin derived from certain rare amphibians, virtually undetectable by conventional testing methods. The symptoms, sudden cardiac arrest without visible cause, match precisely those observed in our present victims." I admired, not for the first time, Holmes's ability to weave fact and fiction into a seamless narrative that satisfied the rational mind while concealing more outlandish truths. The case he referenced had indeed involved South American smugglers, though the toxins in question had produced very different symptoms. "And you believe this poison was somehow incorporated into the craftsmanship of the miniature chamber?" Gregson persisted, still not entirely convinced. "Almost certainly," Holmes replied, "perhaps in the varnish or adhesives used in its construction. When handlers manipulated it extensively, as did the auctioneer, the curator, and Miss Emily, they absorbed a lethal dose through their skin. The gardener, having briefer contact, received only enough to trigger the cardiac episode that claimed his life." Lord Blackwood entered as Holmes was speaking, looking remarkably recovered from the strain of previous days. He nodded a greeting to us all before taking his place at the head of the table. "Inspector," he acknowledged Gregson, "I trust Mr. Holmes has provided a satisfactory explanation for these unfortunate events?" "It appears so, my lord," Gregson replied, closing his notebook. "Though I shall need to include in my report that the chamber itself is to be surrendered to scientific authorities for further analysis and proper disposal of the toxic materials." "Of course," Lord Blackwood agreed readily. "Professor Summers has already made arrangements with colleagues at the British Museum. The object will leave Thornfield today under appropriate precautions." Summers himself joined us shortly thereafter, looking haggard but satisfied. He had spent the remainder of the night documenting the chamber's properties and preparing a detailed protocol for its safe transportation and subsequent handling. "All is in readiness," he informed us. "I've engaged a specialized courier service that regularly transports delicate archaeological artifacts. They should arrive by noon." Breakfast concluded, Holmes and I accompanied Summers to the laboratory for a final inspection of the chamber before its departure. The protective circle remained intact, though the phosphorescent glow had faded to barely visible traces on the floor. The chamber itself sat innocuously beneath its canvas covering, appearing, at least to ordinary perception, as nothing more extraordinary than a masterpiece of miniature craftsmanship. "You're certain the connection remains severed?" Holmes asked Summers, his caution evident in his tone. "As certain as one can be in such matters," the professor replied. "The ritual was effective, and Dr. Watson's participation provided the necessary link for complete severance. However," he hesitated, glancing at me. "However," I prompted, "the experience may have left its mark on you in ways not immediately apparent," Summers admitted. "Your consciousness briefly existed in both realms simultaneously, a condition few humans have experienced and survived intact. There may be residual effects." "I feel perfectly well," I assured them both, though, in truth, I had noticed subtle alterations in my perception since the ritual. Colors seemed slightly more vibrant, shadows marginally deeper, and occasionally, from the corner of my eye, I caught glimpses of geometric patterns superimposed on ordinary objects. These phenomena were neither distressing nor distracting, merely curious, like discovering a new sense that complemented the familiar five. Holmes studied me with his penetrating gaze. "Nevertheless, I shall keep a close watch on you when we return to London. Any unusual symptoms must be documented and analyzed. Your concern is appreciated but unnecessary," I told him with a smile, "though I admit the experience has left me with a profound curiosity about the nature of reality that I suspect will not soon fade." "A natural response," Summers observed. "Those who glimpse beyond the veil rarely return to their former perspectives, unaltered. The question is whether such alterations represent enhancement or impairment of one's faculties. In Watson's case, undoubtedly the former," Holmes stated with unexpected warmth. "His ability to integrate extraordinary experiences while maintaining his essential rationality has always been among his most valuable qualities." This rare compliment from my friend brought a flush of pleasure to my cheeks, though I merely nodded in acknowledgement. The remainder of the morning passed swiftly in final preparations. Inspector Gregson completed his interviews with the household staff, apparently satisfied with the explanation Holmes had provided. By noon, the specialized courier service had arrived. Two serious-looking gentlemen in nondescript attire who handled the crated chamber with professional care, following Summers's detailed instructions regarding its transportation. As the crate was loaded into their specially equipped carriage, Lord Blackwood stood beside me on the front steps, his expression a complex mixture of relief and lingering apprehension. "Do you think it's truly over, Dr. Watson?" he asked quietly. "Or merely contained for now?" I considered the question carefully before responding. "The immediate danger has passed," I told him with conviction. "The connection that allowed the entity access to our world has been severed. As for the larger implications of what we've encountered," I shrugged slightly, "those may take a lifetime to fully comprehend." Lord Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "Emily would have been fascinated by it all, despite the danger. She always valued knowledge above safety. Perhaps that was her undoing. Or perhaps," I suggested gently, "it was her contribution to a greater understanding. Without her detailed notes and translations, we might never have discerned the chamber's true nature in time to prevent further tragedies." A faint smile touched his lips. "A comforting thought, Doctor. I shall endeavor to remember her curiosity, rather than her fate." As we prepared to depart Thornfield Hall later that afternoon, Professor Summers approached me with a small leather-bound journal. "My observations and theories regarding the chamber and the entity it contained," he explained, placing it in my hands. "I've made a copy for my own records, but thought you might find this useful in processing your experience." I accepted the journal with sincere gratitude. Most kind of you, Professor. I confess I have many questions that remain unanswered. As do I, he admitted with the humble enthusiasm of a true scholar. We have glimpsed the shoreline of an uncharted ocean, Dr. Watson. The true exploration has barely begun. With final farewells exchanged, Holmes and I boarded the train that would return us to London and the familiar comforts of Baker Street. As Thornfield Hall receded in the distance, I felt a curious mixture of relief and something akin to nostalgia. Not for the danger we had faced, but for the moment of transcendent understanding I had briefly experienced. "You're unusually contemplative, Watson," Holmes observed as the train gathered speed. "Still dwelling on our extraordinary case?" "I suspect I shall be dwelling on it for quite some time," I admitted. "Some experiences cannot be easily filed away, even in your methodical mind." Holmes nodded, his own expression thoughtful. "Indeed. Though I maintain that even the seemingly supernatural can ultimately be explained through rational principles, I concede that those principles may extend far beyond our current understanding." "A remarkably open-minded position for you, Holmes," I noted with some surprise. He offered a rare, genuine smile. "Perhaps your influence is finally having its effect, old friend. Or perhaps this case has expanded my own parameters of possibility, just as it has yours." As the landscape of Berkshire gave way to the approaching outskirts of London, I opened Summers's journal and began to read, eager to compare his scholarly observations with my direct experience. Whatever lingering connection I might have to the entity and its realm, I was determined to approach it not with fear, but with the careful, methodical curiosity that Holmes himself had taught me to value above all else. The mystery of the Victorian chamber would likely never be fully resolved, but perhaps that was fitting. Some questions were meant to remain partially answered, some thresholds meant to be glimpsed, but not crossed. In that liminal space between knowledge and mystery, I had found a new appreciation for both the rational world Holmes inhabited and the greater unknowns that lay beyond it. Chapter 12. The chamber's echo, our return to Baker Street, brought with it the comfortable familiarity of routine. Mrs. Hudson's fussing over our prolonged absence, the stack of correspondence awaiting Holmes's attention, the lingering smell of chemical experiments from his last investigation. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, I sensed a subtle shift in our shared world, as though the foundations of reality had been imperceptibly realigned. Holmes immersed himself immediately in the accumulated requests for his services, sorting the letters into his characteristic piles of trivial, potentially interesting, and worthy of immediate attention. I watched this familiar process with newfound appreciation for the orderly mind that could so efficiently categorize and prioritize the chaos of human problems. "Nothing here approaches the singularity of the Thornfield Hall affair," he remarked, tossing aside a letter with evident disappointment. "Embezzlement, marital indiscretions, missing jewelry, the mundane catalogue of human weakness. Perhaps we should be grateful for mundanity after our recent experience," I suggested, settling into my accustomed chair by the fire. Holmes cast me a shrewd glance. "You're still processing it, aren't you? The chamber, the entity, your role in the unbinding ritual. I can see it in your eyes, a certain distance, as though you're simultaneously here and elsewhere." His perception, as always, was uncomfortably accurate. Since the ritual, I had experienced moments of peculiar dissociation, brief intervals when ordinary reality seemed to shimmer at its edges, revealing glimpses of geometric patterns and impossible angles just beyond normal perception. "It's nothing alarming," I assured him. "More like an expanded awareness, as though I suddenly acquired the ability to perceive ultraviolet light or hear frequencies beyond the normal human range." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Summers mentioned this possibility, a residual connection to the other realm gradually fading, but perhaps never entirely disappearing." He leaned forward, his expression unusually earnest. "You must promise to document these experiences, Watson. They represent valuable data on a phenomenon that has rarely been scientifically observed." "I've already begun a private journal," I admitted, patting my breast pocket where I kept a small notebook, though I find myself struggling to articulate sensations that exist largely outside conventional language. "A writer's challenge," Holmes observed with a slight smile, "to capture the ineffable in mere words." The following days settled into a rhythm of familiar cases interspersed with my ongoing attempts to document the subtle after-effects of our encounter. Holmes had accepted a straightforward blackmail case that required little of his unique talents, leaving him ample time to observe me with the same intensity he typically reserved for chemical experiments. One evening, approximately a week after our return, I was writing up my medical notes when a peculiar sensation washed over me, a momentary disorientation, as though gravity had briefly shifted its angle. I glanced up to find Holmes watching me intently. "It happened again," he stated rather than asked. I nodded, reaching for my notebook. "A feeling of spatial distortion, lasting perhaps 3 seconds, less intense than previous occurrences." "And the frequency of these episodes?" "Diminishing," I confirmed, "from several times daily immediately following the ritual to now perhaps once or twice a day." Holmes seemed satisfied by this progression. "As Summers predicted, a gradual reintegration of your consciousness fully into our reality." Before I could respond, a sharp knock at our door heralded the arrival of a telegram. Holmes retrieved it from Mrs. Hudson, his eyebrows rising slightly as he read its contents. "From Professor Summers," he informed me, passing the telegram for my inspection. The message was brief but unsettling. "Chamber arrived safely. Stop unusual. Activity detected during preliminary examination. Stop request your presence. British Museum Basement Laboratory, tomorrow 10 a.m. Stop Watson, particularly stop Summers. Unusual activity?" I echoed, a chill running down my spine despite the warmth of our sitting room. "I thought the connection was severed." "Evidently not as completely as we believed," Holmes replied, already reaching for his pipe, a sure sign that his mind was engaged with a problem requiring deep contemplation. "Though Summers's telegram is frustratingly vague regarding the nature of this activity. He wouldn't have requested our presence, mine in particular, unless the matter was significant," I reasoned, trying to suppress the unease growing within me. Holmes observed me closely through a cloud of pipe smoke. "You're concerned that your participation in the ritual has established a more lasting connection than we anticipated." It wasn't a question, but I nodded nonetheless. The possibility had occurred to me. "We shall discover the truth tomorrow," Holmes declared with characteristic decisiveness. "In the meantime, I suggest you continue your documentation with particular attention to any changes in your perceptual experiences." Sleep proved elusive that night. I drifted in and out of shallow dreams populated by impossible geometries and shifting perspectives. In one particularly vivid sequence, I found myself once again peering into the miniature chamber, but this time I was simultaneously viewing it from within, looking outward at my own face pressed against the tiny windows. I awoke from this disquieting vision with a start, the bedside clock showing just past 3 in the morning. Unable to return to sleep, I sat at my writing desk and attempted to capture the dream's peculiar quality of dual perspective. As I wrote, I became aware of a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from my dresser drawer, precisely where I had stored Professor Summers's journal. With considerable trepidation, I approached the drawer and slowly pulled it open. The leather-bound journal lay exactly as I had placed it, but as I watched, its cover trembled slightly in time with the tapping sound, which now resolved itself into a pattern. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short again. Morse code for SOS. Gathering my courage, I lifted the journal and opened it to find that additional text had appeared on several pages. cramped, hurried writing that overlaid Summers's neat academic script. The new text appeared to be in Latin, though with certain characters that belonged to no alphabet I recognized. I carried the journal to Holmes's door, knocking with sufficient urgency to rouse him immediately. He appeared in his dressing gown, instantly alert despite the hour. "The journal," I explained simply, holding it out to him. "Something has changed." Holmes took it to his room, where a stronger lamp allowed better examination. He studied the new text carefully, occasionally referencing a Latin dictionary from his bookshelf. "Most interesting," he murmured finally. "It appears to be a warning, though couched in rather obscure theological terminology. The essence, as best I can translate, suggests that the severance was incomplete, and what was bound remains connected." "Connected? To what?" I demanded. "Or to whom?" Holmes met my gaze directly. "To you, Watson. The text specifically references the one who stood at the threshold, and indicates that you serve as a— I believe the closest translation would be anchor point, or perhaps tether." The implication struck me with disturbing clarity. "The entity is using my residual connection to communicate through the journal." "So it would appear," Holmes agreed grimly. "And if it can affect the journal, one must wonder what else might fall within its influence. But to what purpose? A warning? A threat?" Holmes closed the journal thoughtfully. "That, I suspect, is precisely what Professor Summers wishes to discuss tomorrow. The question now is whether we should wait until morning or proceed to the museum immediately." I glanced at the clock, considering the urgency against the practicalities of arriving at the British Museum in the middle of the night. "The message came as an SOS, I noted. That suggests immediate danger." "My thoughts exactly," Holmes replied, already moving to dress. "We shall rouse the household if necessary. This development warrants interrupting even museum protocols." Within half an hour, we were in a hansom cab speeding through London's deserted streets toward the British Museum, the mysterious journal secured in Holmes's coat pocket, and a growing sense of foreboding settling over us both.